In 1958, a horrific train crash left a woman's body shattered and her father dead beside her. The survivor in the wreckage was none other than Suzy Parker, the most famous face on earth. She was the first true supermodel, the muse of Chanel, the woman who had it all. But behind the legendary blue eyes was a fire, born from trauma. This is the untold story of how the world's most beautiful woman spent the rest of her life trying to escape her own reflection. This is not just a story about fashion. It is a story about sisters, about secrets, and about a car crash on a dark road that shattered the most beautiful mirror in the world. She liked to say she was a Texas girl, born in the dust and heat of San Antonio during the Depression, though in truth, her birth certificate pointed to Long Island City, New York. But the Parker family was not poor. They were eccentric. Her father, George Parker, was a restless, mechanically minded man who worked in engineering and shipping and filled the house with books and ideas. Her mother, Elizabeth, was a Southern belle with a spine of steel and a fierce ambition for her daughters. But Suzy was not the first beauty in the family. She was the third. The Parker household was a hothouse of female beauty. There was the eldest sister, Florian, a stunner who married well. And then there was Dorian. Dorian Lee was nearly 20 years older than Suzy. By the time Suzy was playing with dolls, Dorian was already conquering New York. Dorian was one of the first great models of the 1940s, a woman of immense charm and chaotic, romantic energy. She was the trailblazer, the one who hacked through the jungle of the modeling industry to clear a path. Suzy grew up in the long, cool shadow of Dorian. To be the little sister of a famous beauty is a complicated psychological position. You are always the sequel. You are always the other one. Suzy adored Dorian, but she also observed her. She watched Dorian's chaotic love life, her financial ups and downs, her desperate need for approval. And quietly in the back of her mind, Suzy began to take notes. Don't be like Dorian, she surely told herself. Don't be messy, be smart. Suzy was a tomboy. She was lanky, awkward, and taller than all the boys. She had flaming red hair in an era that preferred cool blondes like Grace Kelly. She didn't think she was beautiful. She thought she was a giraffe. She wanted to be a writer or a mechanic, or anything that didn't involve standing still and looking pretty. But genetics is destiny. When Suzy was 15, her mother took her to New York to visit Dorian. It was 1947. The city was vibrating with post-war energy. Dorian, ever the operator, took one look at her little sister, who was now 5 feet 10 inches, with a face structure that looked like it had been carved by Michelangelo, and dragged her to see Eileen Ford. Eileen Ford was the high priestess of modeling. She ran the Ford agency with an iron fist. She had seen thousands of pretty girls from the Midwest. She was cynical, tough, and hard to impress. Dorian shoved Suzy into the office. "This is my sister," she said. "She's going to be a star." Eileen Ford looked at the terrified, gangly teenager in the bad dress. She looked at the red hair. She looked at the bone structure. "She's too tall," Ford said, "and her nose is too big." But Dorian insisted. And perhaps, just perhaps, Eileen Ford saw something in Suzy's eyes. A spark of defiance, a hint of intelligence that made her reconsider. She signed her. It was the beginning of the Parker era. But Suzy didn't start at the bottom. She didn't do catalog work for Sears. She started at the top. Her first major booking was for Life magazine. Not a local paper, Life, the biggest magazine in America. She was 15 years old, claiming to be 19, standing in front of the camera with a confidence she didn't feel. But when the shutter clicked, something magical happened. Suzy Parker didn't just pose. She acted. She didn't just wear the dress. She inhabited it. She created a character. If the dress was romantic, she became a woman in love. If the suit was severe, she became a CEO. She moved. She laughed. She talked to the photographer. In a world of silent statues, Suzy Parker was a talkie. By 1950, Suzy was the face of the future, but New York was too small for her. The real game was across the ocean, in the shattered, rebuilding capital of elegance, Paris. Paris in the 1950s was a city of ghosts and glamour. The war was over, but the scars were everywhere. Yet, in the ateliers of the great fashion houses, Dior, Balenciaga, Givenchy, beauty was being manufactured with a desperate intensity. The French needed beauty to forget the ugly years. Suzy arrived in Paris like a heat wave. She was American, loud, funny, and unmistakably modern. She didn't speak French, but she spoke the language of the camera fluently. It was here that she met the man who would become her creative soulmate, Richard Avedon. Dick Avedon was not your typical fashion photographer. He was a revolutionary. He hated the static, stiff poses of the past. He wanted movement. He wanted emotion. He wanted life. When he met Suzy Parker, it was like a chemical reaction. He saw in her the perfect instrument for his vision. She was athletic. She could run. She could jump. She could cry on cue. She was never just a model, Avedon later said. She was a collaborator. We would write a script in our heads before we started shooting. You are waiting for a lover who is never coming. You have just won the lottery. She played the part. Together, Avedon and Parker changed visual culture. Think of the famous photo of Suzy in the evening gown, roller skating with a wildly joyous expression. That was them. They took fashion out of the studio and onto the streets. They made it fun. But the pinnacle of her Paris conquest was Coco Chanel. Chanel was a legend, but by the 1950s, she was an aging legend trying to make a comeback. She was difficult, sharp-tongued, and hated almost everyone. But she loved Suzy Parker. Why? Because Suzy wasn't afraid of her. Suzy would march into the atelier at Rue Cambon, throw her bag on the floor, and crack a joke. Chanel saw in Suzy the same rebellious spirit she had possessed in the 1920s. Suzy became the face of Chanel. She was the woman every rich European wanted to be. She was elegant, yes, but she looked like she could also fix a flat tire or win a poker game. She was the American aristocrat, a new breed of royalty based on charisma rather than blood. The money began to pour in, and Suzy, ever the smart Parker girl, didn't hand it over to a manager. She managed it herself. She demanded $200 an hour when other girls were getting $25. She became the first model to break the $100,000 a year ceiling. She famously said, "I believe in the gold standard. I am the gold standard." But amidst the champagne and the couture, there was a loneliness to Suzy Parker. She was surrounded by men, photographers, designers, playboys, who loved her image. But who loved Suzy? She had a brief, secret marriage in high school that she annulled. She had a disastrous short marriage to a journalist named Pierre de La Salle in 1955. It was a secret. Why? Because in the 1950s, a model was supposed to be a miss, a single fantasy. A wife was a different category. So Suzy lived a double life. To the world, she was the carefree, single, it girl of Paris. In private, she was a woman trying to find a connection that felt real in a world made of artificial light. She was also nursing a growing frustration. Modeling, for all its money, was boring. Suzy was intelligent. She read Proust between takes. She wrote short stories. She felt her brain atrophying while her face was immortalized. "It's just clothes," she would say to Avedon moments after creating a masterpiece. "It doesn't mean anything." She wanted more. She wanted to act. She wanted to speak. And Hollywood, always hungry for the next beautiful thing, was listening. In 1957, the call came, not just for a screen test, but for a role that was essentially a meta-commentary on her own life. The movie was Funny Face, starring Fred Astaire and Audrey Hepburn. The plot? A fashion photographer discovers a shy bookstore clerk and turns her into a model. Suzy Parker was cast in a cameo as the lead model in the Think Pink musical number. It was a joke, really. She was playing the ideal that Audrey Hepburn was supposed to subvert. But when Suzy appeared on screen, dazzling in pink, commanding the room, the audience gasped. She had presence. She had weight. Hollywood decided to make her a star. She was cast opposite Cary Grant in Kiss Them for Me. Cary Grant, the biggest star in the world. It was a dream scenario, but Suzy found the transition to acting brutal. In modeling, she was the director of her own stillness. In movies, she was a prop. She had to hit marks. She had to memorize lines that were often vapid. She struggled with the technicalities of film acting. She felt stiff. The critics were unkind. They called her beautiful but wooden. They dismissed her as a clothes horse trying to gallop. It hurt. Suzy Parker had never failed at anything in her life. She was the girl who conquered Paris. She was the gold standard. Now she was being told she was just a pretty face, but Suzy wasn't a quitter. She doubled down. She took acting classes. She fought for better roles. She was determined to prove that she was more than just a cover girl. By 1958, she was living in Los Angeles, driving a convertible, dating beautiful men, and trying to crack the code of Hollywood. She was 25 years old. She had the world on a string, but strings can snap. It was June 1958. Suzy was visiting her father, George Parker, in Florida. She loved her father. He was the one who had given her the books, the curiosity, the intellect. He was her anchor. They were driving together. A leisurely drive. The sun was shining. They were probably talking about books or the future, or maybe just enjoying the silence of being together. They approached a railroad crossing. What happened next is a blur of metal and noise that would haunt Suzy Parker for the rest of her life. The car stalled. The train was moving too fast. The driver didn't see the signal. The details are academic. The impact was absolute. The train slammed into the car. In that split second, the golden era of Suzy Parker ended. The camera shutter clicked shut. The lights went out. When she woke up in the hospital, her world had been destroyed. Her body, her fortune, her instrument, her masterpiece was broken. Shattered arms, broken shoulders, a face that was swollen and bruised. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the news the doctors had to deliver. Her father was dead. The man who had taught her to think, the man she loved most in the world, had died in the seat next to her, and she had survived. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the casts on her arms. Why her? Why the model and not the inventor? Why the face and not the brain? Suzy Parker lay in that hospital bed staring at the ceiling, and the it girl died. The woman who emerged from that room would never be the same. She would never care about a dress again. She would never care about a magazine cover again. She had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had taken her father. The recovery was long and grueling. The press, with their vulture-like instinct for tragedy, circled the hospital. Beauty broken, the headline screamed. Will she ever model again? They didn't care about her grief. They cared about her face. It was this callousness, this reduction of her tragedy to a question of aesthetics that planted the seed of her final disappearance. Suzy realized with a cold clarity that the world didn't love her. It loved her utility. It loved her as long as she was perfect. Broken, she was just a story. The year 1958 stands as the dividing line in the life of Suzy Parker. Before the crash, She was a creature of air and light, soaring above the world on the wings of her beauty. After the crash, she was a creature of earth and gravity, weighed down by loss and the scars, both visible and invisible, that she now carried. She would model again, yes. Avedon would photograph her again. But the eyes were different. The joy that had defined her earlier work, that joyous, running, jumping energy, was replaced by a knowing, melancholic depth. She was no longer the girl who had everything. She was the woman who had lost the most important thing. And in the silence of her recovery, Suzy Parker began to plan her escape. She realized that the camera could steal your soul if you let it. She needed to find a place where she could just be Suzy, not Suzy Parker the face. She needed a sanctuary. She didn't know it yet, but the sanctuary would come in the form of a man she hadn't met and a life she hadn't yet imagined. The second act was about to begin, and it would be a radical departure from the script the world had written for her. But the shattered glass on the railroad tracks was only the physical debris. The true wreckage lay in the sudden, violent death of the girl who thought she was invincible. As the ambulances screamed toward the scene, carrying the broken body of the world's most beautiful woman away from the corpse of her father, the curtain fell on the Technicolor dream of the 1950s. Suzy was about to enter a new, darker chapter, one where the camera's flash would no longer feel like a caress, but like an interrogation she was too weak to answer. The silence of a hospital room is a terrible thing for a woman used to the click of a shutter. In the summer of 1958, Suzy Parker lay in a hospital bed in Florida, her body a map of trauma. Both arms were broken. Her shoulders were shattered. Glass was embedded in her face, the face that Vogue had insured for thousands, the face that had launched 1,000 trends. But the physical pain, agonizing as it was drowned out by the psychic scream of her father's death. She had survived the train crash that killed him. Survivor's guilt is a heavy coat to wear, and for Suzy, it was suffocating. She felt that the universe had punished her for her vanity, for her success, for leaving the safety of her family to chase the neon lights of Paris and Hollywood. The press, relentless and cruel, camped outside. They wanted a picture of the broken doll. They speculated wildly. Will she be scarred? Is her career over? To them, Suzy Parker wasn't a grieving daughter. She was a damaged asset, a racehorse with a broken leg. But Suzy Parker came from stock that didn't break easily. Her mother, the formidable Elizabeth, and her sister Dorian rallied around her. They protected her. They managed the press. And Suzy, fueled by a mixture of grief and defiance, decided she would not vanish. Not yet. Her return to modeling in 1959 was nothing short of miraculous, but it was a different kind of modeling. The effortless, joyous girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the fragility of bone and the permanence of loss. Richard Avedon, her artistic soulmate, understood this. He didn't try to hide her pain. He used it. The photos from this period are darker, more intense. There is a haunting quality to her gaze. She wasn't just looking at the camera, she was looking through it. But while she was reclaiming her throne in fashion, her personal life was spiraling into a secret melodrama that would have shocked her fans. In 1959, at the height of her comeback, Suzy Parker disappeared again. The press was told she was resting. The truth was far more scandalous. She was pregnant. In the conservative moral landscape of 1959 America, an unwed mother, or a divorcee with a secret child, was a career-ending pariah. Suzy had secretly married the French journalist Pierre de La Salle years earlier, but the marriage was a wreck and the timeline was messy. To the public, she was America's sweetheart, the single it girl. A baby didn't fit the narrative, so in a move that echoed the tragic hidden pregnancies of old Hollywood, Suzy went into hiding. She gave birth to her daughter Georgia in December 1959. Imagine the psychological fracture. She is the most famous face in the world, yet she is hiding a newborn baby in the shadows like a shameful secret. She couldn't push a stroller in Central Park. She couldn't talk about sleepless nights in interviews. She had to pretend to be the carefree bachelorette while her heart was tethered to a crib she couldn't acknowledge publicly. It was another layer of the mask. First, the model, then the actress. Now, the secret mother. Suzy was compartmentalizing her life to the point of schizophrenia. Hollywood, meanwhile, was not done with her. They still wanted to make Suzy Parker movie star happen, regardless of her lack of enthusiasm. She was cast in The Best of Everything, 1959, a glossy soap opera about working women in New York. It was a hit, but it felt hollow. She was playing a version of herself, the neurotic, beautiful career woman. Then came the film that would change her life, not because it was good, but because of who was standing on the other side of the set. The movie was Circle of Deception, a grim World War II spy thriller filmed in London. Suzy was cast as the female lead. The male lead was a serious, brooding actor named Bradford Dillman. Bradford Dillman was not Cary Grant. He wasn't a megastar. He was a Yale-educated, actor-studio-trained thespian who took his craft seriously. He was cynical about Hollywood fame. He didn't care about Vogue. He didn't care about Chanel. When they met on set, the friction was instant. Bradford thought Suzy was a high-maintenance model, foisted upon him by the studio. Suzy thought Bradford was a stuffy actor who looked down on her. They fought. They bickered. He criticized her acting. She criticized his seriousness. But there is a thin line between irritation and attraction. One night, after a particularly grueling day of shooting in the damp English weather, the walls came down. Suzy, exhausted by the pretense, dropped the Suzy Parker act. She talked about her father. She talked about the crash. She talked about Georgia, her secret daughter. Bradford listened. He didn't see the glamour, he saw the wounds. And unlike the playboys and the photographers who treated her like a trophy, Bradford treated her like a person in trouble. He fell in love, not with the face, but with the woman behind it. And Suzy, who had spent her life being looked at, finally felt seen. But their romance was messy. Suzy was still untangling herself from Pierre de La Salle. The press was sniffing around, and Bradford was a working actor who wanted a normal life, not a circus. "I don't want to be Mr. Parker," he told her. "I don't want to be Suzy Parker either," she replied. It was a pact, a mutual desire to escape the machinery of fame. However, the machine doesn't let go easily. In the early 1960s, Suzy was still commanding astronomical fees. She was still the face of the moment, but the joy was completely gone. She described modeling as selling a lie. She described Hollywood as a meat market. She became known as difficult. She refused interviews. She showed up late. She was sabotaging her own career, subconsciously trying to get fired so she could be free. The tipping point came in 1963. Suzy and Bradford married on a ship at sea, a romantic private gesture to avoid the paparazzi. But the real commitment wasn't the wedding. It was the decision that followed. Suzy Parker looked at her bank account, which was full. She looked at her closet, which was full of couture she never wore. She looked at her daughter Georgia, who needed a full-time mother, not a secret visitor. And she looked at Bradford, who offered her a life of sanity. She made a decision that baffled the industry. She quit. She didn't just retire, she abdicated. She canceled bookings. She fired agents. She told Vogue she was done. "I'm tired of being a clothes hanger," she said. "I want to be a human being." The industry was shocked. Models didn't quit in their prime. They rode the wave until it crashed. But Suzy jumped off the board. She and Bradford moved to Montecito, California, a quiet, wealthy enclave far from the flashing lights of the Sunset Strip. They bought a house tucked away in the hills. They built a wall, both literal and metaphorical. For the first time since she was 15 years old, Suzy Parker didn't have to smile on cue. She didn't have to worry about her weight. She didn't have to hide her child. She became Mrs. Dillman. She had 3 more children. With Bradford, she baked bread, she gardened, she drove a station wagon. To the neighbors in Montecito, she was just the tall, striking woman with the red hair who picked up her kids from school. Most of them had no idea that the face looking at them across the produce aisle was the face that had defined the 20th century. But you cannot simply turn off a legend. The world kept knocking. Avedon called, begging for one last shoot. Chanel called. The magazines called. For years, Suzy said no. She was happy in her anonymity. She was healing. But the Capote era wasn't done with her. There was one final tragic intersection with the glittering world she had left behind. Her sister, Dorian Lee. Dorian, the first Parker beauty, had not found the peace Suzy had found. Dorian's life was a chaotic swirl of marriages, affairs, and tragedies. And as Suzy settled into domestic bliss, she watched from a distance as her sister's life began to unravel in the most horrific way possible. The shadow of the Parker beauty curse had skipped Suzy, but it was hunting Dorian. And the pain of witnessing her sister's descent would be the final test of Suzy's hard-won sanctuary. By 1965, Suzy Parker had successfully pulled off the greatest magic trick in celebrity history. She had become invisible. She cut her famous red hair. She wore no makeup. She gained weight happily and defiantly. She embraced the ordinariness of life with the zeal of a convert. But deep down, the artist in her, the girl who had created masterpieces with Avedon, still flickered. She channeled that creativity into her home, into her cooking, into her children. She treated motherhood not as a duty, but as the role of a lifetime. Yet there were moments when she would catch her reflection in a shop window and see the ghost of the girl in the Dior gown. Moments when a song on the radio would take her back to a rainy street in Paris. She didn't miss the fame, she missed the art. But she knew the price of the art was the soul, and she had fought too hard to get hers back. She had built a fortress of love in Montecito, but fortresses are designed to keep things out. What Suzy didn't realize was that sometimes the threat is already inside the walls, in the form of the genetics and the history you can never truly outrun. She had severed the cord to New York and Paris, trading the spotlight for the quiet shadows of the California coast. But geography is not destiny, and Suzy knew that simply moving to the suburbs wouldn't be enough to exorcise the ghosts of the runway. To truly escape, she had to dismantle the very thing that had made her famous. She had to destroy the image of Suzy Parker so that Suzy Dillman could survive. If you drove through the winding, eucalyptus-shaded lanes of Montecito in the late 1960s and early 70s, you might have passed a rambling house hidden behind high hedges. Inside, there was a woman who looked vaguely familiar, though she was heavier now. Her famous red hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hands covered in flour. This was the sanctuary of Mrs. Dillman. Suzy Parker had done something that women of her caliber were not supposed to do. She had embraced mediocrity, not intellectual mediocrity. She was still reading voraciously, but the mediocrity of the daily grind. She became obsessed with being the perfect suburban mother. She drove the carpool. She baked bread from scratch. She sewed costumes for school plays. To the outside observer, it looked like a penance. Was she punishing herself for the vanity of her youth? Was she trying to scrub the glamour off her skin with dish soap? But to Suzy, it was a rebellion. Every loaf of bread was a middle finger to Vogue. Every extra pound she gained was a barricade against the industry that demanded starvation. She was reclaiming her biology. She famously told a reporter who managed to track her down, "I love food more than I love fame. You can't eat a magazine cover." Her marriage to Bradford Dillman was the anchor. In Hollywood, marriages are usually mergers of ego. But the Dillman marriage was a merger of exhaustion. They were both tired of the game. Bradford continued to act to pay the bills, appearing in everything from The Way We Were to Murder, she wrote. But when he came home, the scripts were put away. They didn't talk about the craft. They talked about the plumbing, the kids' grades, the garden. They had 3 children together, Dinah, Charlie, and Christopher, joining Georgia, Suzy's daughter from her secret past. Suzy guarded them with the ferocity of a lioness. She refused to let them model. She barely let them watch television. She wanted them to grow up without the virus of narcissism that she believed infected the entire entertainment industry. But while Suzy was successfully building her fortress against the world was destroying her sister. The story of the Parker sisters is a study in divergent paths. If Suzy was the one who walked away, Dorian Leigh was the one who couldn't let go. Dorian, 15 years older, was the original supermodel, the trailblazer. But by the 1970s, Dorian's life had become a cautionary tale of chaotic excess. She had married 5 times. She had opened modeling agencies that failed. She had written cookbooks. She had chased youth and love across 2 continents, leaving a trail of debris behind her. Suzy loved Dorian, but she feared her life. She watched her sister's frantic attempts to stay relevant, to stay beautiful, to stay solvent. It confirmed everything Suzy believed, that the beauty business was a trap that eventually ate you alive. But the Parker beauty curse, as whispers in New York began to call it, was not satisfied with financial ruin or failed marriages. It demanded blood. In the late 1970s, the ultimate tragedy struck. Dorian's son, Kim, died by suicide, jumping from a high-rise window. The news shattered the Parker family. For Dorian, it was the blow from which she would never truly recover. For Suzy, safe in her fortress in Montecito, it was a terrifying validation of her worst fears. She looked at her own children, safe, bored, normal, and she looked at the wreckage of her sister's life. She realized that the glamour she had escaped wasn't just silly, it was lethal. It chewed up children. It destroyed stability. Suzy's reaction to the tragedy was to lock the gates of Montecito even tighter. She withdrew almost completely from her sister for a time, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. She couldn't let the chaos in. She was terrified that the curse was contagious. The late 1970s became the lost years of Suzy Parker. She became a rumor in Hollywood. Directors would ask about her. Whatever happened to Suzy Parker? They would ask Bradford on set. "She's fine," he would say. "She's making lasagna." They thought he was joking. He wasn't. Suzy rejected millions of dollars in offers to return. Revlon wanted her. Chanel wanted her. They wanted the mature Suzy Parker. They wanted the comeback story. She sent the contracts back unsigned. She didn't want to be a mature model. She didn't want to be examined for wrinkles. She didn't want to stand in front of a lens and try to summon the ghost of the girl she used to be. "That girl is dead," she told a friend, "and I don't miss her." She made a few scattered TV appearances, a Twilight Zone episode in the early 1960s, a night gallery story, and the odd guest spot alongside Bradford, mostly to help pay bills, then slipped quietly back into her domestic life. But as the 1980s dawned, bringing with them the era of the supermodel, Cindy, Naomi, Linda, the world began to look for the original. They looked for the blueprint. Fashion historians began to dig up the old Avedon photos. They marveled at the energy, the modernity. a new generation discovered Suzy Parker. They saw a woman who looked like them, alive, active, distinct. Journalists began to hunt her down again. They wanted the elder stateswoman of fashion to comment on the new girls. "What do you think of the supermodels?" they would ask, calling the house in Montecito. Suzy's answer was always the same, delivered with a dry smoker's rasp. "I think they are overworked and underfed, and I hope they are saving their money." She refused to romanticize the profession. She refused to play the role of the nostalgic icon. To her, modeling was the most meaningless profession in the world. There is a poignant anecdote from this period. Richard Avedon, her old partner in crime, came to visit her in California. They hadn't worked together in decades. Avedon was still the king of photography. Suzy was a housewife. They sat on her patio. Suzy was heavy, wearing no makeup, dressed in a caftan. Avedon looked at her. Most men would have been disappointed. They would have mourned the loss of the it girl. But Avedon, with his artist's eye, saw something else. He saw the life she had lived etched into her face. He saw the grief for her father, the love for her husband, the fear for her sister. "You're still the most interesting face I know, Suzy," he said. "Don't you dare take my picture, Dick," she warned, lighting a cigarette. "I won't," he promised. "I'll just remember it." It was a moment of peace between the image and the reality. Suzy realized that she hadn't failed by aging. She had succeeded. She had survived the industry that wanted to freeze her in amber. She had grown up. She had grown old. And in the world of Suzy Parker, that was the ultimate victory. But the victory would be short-lived. The shadows were lengthening in Montecito. Her breathing worsened. The pain deepened, and it became clear that the final chapter would not be glamorous, but a quiet, painful fade into the dark. The fortress of Montecito had held for decades, protecting her from the vanity of the industry she despised, but it could not protect her from the passage of time or the voracious nostalgia of a new generation. Just as her body began its slow, inevitable betrayal, the fashion world decided it wasn't finished with its favorite muse, reaching over the garden walls to demand one final bow from a woman who had long since left the stage. By the 1990s, the world of fashion had mutated into something unrecognizable to the generation of the 1950s. It was the era of the supermodel. Linda, Christy, Naomi, Cindy, they were mononyms, global brands, rock stars. They were earning millions, dating movie stars, and creating an industry of pure, uncut glamour. Journalists and fashion historians looking for the genealogy of this phenomenon kept tracing the bloodline back to one source, Suzy Parker. They called the house in Montecito. They sent letters. They wanted to interview the godmother of the supermodel. They wanted to drag her out of retirement to crown the new queens. Suzy Parker, now in her 60s, sat in her kitchen, surrounded by dogs and grandchildren, and threw the letters in the trash. "They don't want me," she told her husband Bradford. "They want the ghost, and she doesn't live here anymore." Suzy's refusal to participate in her own myth-making was absolute. Most stars, as they age, become desperate to polish their legacy. They write memoirs. They do "Where Are They Now?" specials. They cling to the spotlight like a life raft. Suzy did the opposite. She treated her past career like a strange, slightly embarrassing summer job she had held as a teenager. When her children's friends would ask, "Is it true your mom was the most beautiful woman in the world?" her children would shrug. To them, she was just mom, the woman who drove a station wagon and yelled at them to finish their homework. This was Suzy's greatest masterpiece, the normalcy of her family. She had successfully inoculated them against the virus of fame. But while her mind remained sharp, her wit as dry and crackling as autumn leaves, her body was beginning to crumble. The trauma of the 1958 train crash, which she had survived through sheer force of will, was presenting its bill with decades of interest. By then, the damage from the 1958 crash and a lifetime of bad habits was already written all over her body, but she'd long since stopped caring what the mirror had to say. Walking became difficult. The athletic grace that Avedon had captured, the running, the jumping, was gone. She moved slowly, carefully. Then came the respiratory issues, years of smoking, the ubiquitous habit of the 50s fashion set, combined with a series of throat surgeries, left her voice raspy and her breathing labored. She developed diabetes. She had kidney problems. For a woman whose identity had been tied to her physicality, this could have been a psychological catastrophe. But Suzy Parker had made peace with her mirror long ago. She didn't mourn her beauty because she had never trusted it. She viewed her body now not as a ruined temple, but simply as a vehicle that was running out of gas. The dynamic in the Dillman household shifted. Bradford Dillman, the dashing actor who had swept her away from the madness of Paris, became her nurse. Their love story, which began on a movie set in London, entered its profound final act in the sick room in Montecito. Bradford retired from acting to care for her. He cooked. He drove her to doctors. He managed her medications. There were no paparazzi around to document this phase. There were no Vogue spreads. But this was the truest romance of Suzy's life. It wasn't the flashbulb love of the 50s. It was the quiet, unglamorous love of service. Bradford protected her dignity ferociously. He shielded her from the prying eyes of the world, ensuring that no one saw the queen of fashion in her decline. In the late 90s, a documentary crew famously tried to film a retrospective on her life. They offered money. They offered control. Suzy sent back a message that was pure Parker. I am busy dying. I don't have time for television. She wasn't being melodramatic. She was being practical. She knew the end was coming. Her world shrank. It went from the boulevards of Paris to the streets of New York, then to the hills of Montecito, and finally to the perimeter of her bedroom and her garden. But even as her world grew smaller, her spirit remained untamed. She spent her days reading. She consumed books by the dozen, history, biography, fiction. She remained intellectually voracious. She would argue about politics with her children. She would critique the terrible acting on the soap operas she watched. She also kept a wary eye on her sister, Dorian. Dorian Lee, now in her 80s, was living on the East Coast, still trying to hustle, still trying to write cookbooks, still trying to stay in the game. Suzy loved her sister, but she found her inability to let go of the past exhausting. Dorian is still waiting for the phone to ring, Suzy would say, shaking her head. She doesn't realize the line has been cut. It was a harsh assessment, but Suzy was a realist. She knew that the only way to survive the loss of beauty is to stop caring about it. Dorian was still mourning the loss. Suzy had held the funeral for her own vanity 30 years ago. As the new millennium dawned, Suzy's health took a precipitous turn. The diabetes worsened. Her kidneys were failing. She was frequently hospitalized. The hospital visits were a torment. Suzy hated being the patient. She hated the loss of agency. But even in the hospital, the Suzy Parker charisma would occasionally flash. She would charm the nurses. She would make dark, funny jokes about the food. One nurse, not realizing who she was, told her she had lovely bone structure. Suzy looked at her over the oxygen mask and winked. "Honey," she rasped, "you should have seen the rest of it." By 2003, it was clear that there would be no more recoveries. Suzy returned to the house in Montecito to wait for the end. The house was quiet. The children were grown. It was just Suzy and Bradford, the two conspirators who had run away from the circus 40 years earlier. She didn't want a funeral. She didn't want a memorial service filled with fashion people pretending to know her. She wanted silence. In the final weeks, she spent time looking at old photos, not the Vogue covers, not the Chanel ads. She looked at the photos of her children as babies. She looked at the photos of Bradford on their boat. She looked at the photos of her father, George Parker. She realized that her life hadn't been defined by the years she spent on the cover of magazines. Those years were a fever dream, a strange, lucrative accident. Her real life was the one she had fought for in the quiet years. The bread she baked, the garden she planted, the children she raised, the face that stopped time, was ready to let time start again. There's a concept in art called negative space, the space around the subject that defines it. In the history of fashion, Suzy Parker is the ultimate negative space. She is defined as much by what she didn't do as what she did. She didn't stay. She didn't sell out. She didn't become a caricature of herself like Gloria Swanson in Sunset Boulevard. She left a hole in the culture that was never quite filled. The supermodels of the 90s were beautiful, yes, but they were corporate entities. They lacked Suzy's wild, intelligent, subversive edge. They wanted to be famous. Suzy wanted to be free. By refusing to participate in her own legend in her final years, Suzy Parker preserved it. She froze herself in the public imagination as the vibrant, laughing girl in the pink dress in Funny Face. She denied us the image of her decline, and in doing so, she gave us the gift of her immortality. She forced the world to remember her as she was, not as she became. It was her final act of control, her final directorial decision. She shouted, "Cut!" before the scene could get sad. But for Bradford Dillman, sitting by her bedside in Montecito, holding the hand that had once worn the most expensive diamonds in the world, there was no immortality. There was just the crushing human reality of saying goodbye to his wife. The cameras were gone. The audience had left. It was just two people in a room facing the dark together. The perimeter of her life had finally shrunk to the four walls of her bedroom. But inside that space, a profound peace had settled. The noise of the flashbulbs was a distant memory, replaced by the steady breathing of the man who had loved her when the world only wanted to consume her. The long, exhausting performance was finally over, and all that remained was for the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to exit the frame to finally vanish into the white. On May 3rd, 2003, the silence in the house in Montecito became absolute. Suzy Parker died as she had lived for the last 40 years, privately, stubbornly, and on her own terms. She was 70 years old. There was no press release sent out from a hospital bed. There was no final photo op. She simply slipped away in the sanctuary she had built, surrounded by the family she had chosen over the world. Bradford Dillman, her husband of 40 years, the man she had met on a fake movie set and built a real life with, was by her side. When the news finally broke a few days later, it sent a tremor through the fashion world. But it was a strange kind of tremor. It wasn't the hysterical grief that follows the death of a current star. It was the melancholic sigh of an era finally ending. In Paris, Karl Lagerfeld, who had worshipped Suzy's work with Chanel, paused. In New York, the editors of Vogue scrambled to find the archival photos, the negatives from 1954, where she looked like a goddess in tweed. Obituaries appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, and Le Monde. They listed her accomplishments. The first model to make $100,000. The face of Chanel, the muse of Avedon. But reading them felt like reading about a historical figure from the 19th century, not a woman who had just been watching Jeopardy! In California a week before. She had successfully separated her two selves so completely that the world mourned Suzy Parker, the supermodel, while her family mourned Suzy Dillman, the mother. The two women had ceased to be the same person decades ago. There was no state funeral. There was no parade of celebrities in black sunglasses. Suzy had left strict instructions. No circus. She was buried quietly. But the most poignant reaction came from the East Coast, from the one person who had known her before she was Suzy Parker. Dorian Lee was 86 years old when her little sister died. The Parker beauty curse had played its final, cruelest card. Dorian, the wild older sister, who had lived a life of chaos and tragedy, had outlived the sensible younger sister who had done everything right. Dorian was devastated. She wrote a tribute to Suzy, calling her "my beautiful baby sister." But the tragedy was compounded by the years of distance. They had loved each other, but they had lived on different planets, one on the planet of eternal striving, the other on the planet of retreat. Dorian would live for another 5 years, dying in 2008 in a nursing home, closing the book on the Parker dynasty. With them, the specific, high-voltage glamour of the mid-century, that mix of Texas grit and Parisian couture, vanished from the earth. But Suzy Parker left something behind that was more durable than magazines. In the years following her death, a strange thing happened. The fashion world, stuck in a cycle of disposable trends and Instagram influencers, began to look back. And there she was. They rediscovered the Avedon photos. They saw a woman running, laughing, grimacing, living in the clothes. They saw a model who wasn't a hanger, but a narrator. Designers began to put Suzy Parker on their mood boards. Young models were told to study Suzy. She became the patron saint of the personality model, the woman who brings her brain to the shoot. But her true legacy isn't in the industry she despised. It's in the rejection of it. Suzy Parker was the first woman to reach the absolute summit of objectification, to be the most looked at woman in the world, and then say this isn't enough. She proved that a woman could be more than her reflection. She proved that you could walk away from the table while you were still winning. She proved that the most glamorous thing a woman can have is not a Chanel suit, but a private life. In the end, she remains a mystery, a beautiful cipher. We look at the photos of her in the 1950s, so alive, so present, and we feel like we know her, but we don't. We only know the character she played, the real Suzy Parker, the one who baked bread, loved her husband, and died quietly in California, kept herself for herself. And in a world that demands we share everything, that is the ultimate act of elegance. If you go to the Condé Nast archives today and pull the files from 1955, you will be overwhelmed by the sheer force of her image. She is everywhere. She is the sun around which the entire industry orbited. But if you go to Montecito, there is no statue, there is no museum. There is just a house where a family lived. Suzy Parker's life asks us a difficult question. What is the value of beauty? Is it a gift, a currency, or is it a cage? For Suzy, it was all three. It bought her freedom, but it threatened to imprison her soul. Her heroism wasn't in how she looked, it was in how she escaped the trap of being looked at. She was the it girl who grew up. She was the muse who fired the artist. She was the face that stopped time, only so she could step out of the frame and finally truly live it. The lights are off now. The studio is dark. The magazine is closed. But somewhere in the silence, you can still hear her laughter, throaty, cynical, and free, echoing down the hallway, a reminder that she chose a real life over a perfect image.